To be obtuse, last time we counted to 11. We started with the 5 Aristotle gave us, and we kept going from there. Proprioception, vestibular function, thermoception, nociception, interoception, chronoception. 11 sensory systems, give or take a couple, depending on which neuroscientist you ask. And the point of that conversation was that the standard answer to the question how many senses you have is wrong. The body knows more than we have been taught to listen to. Today we want to push that further, because there's a small group of thinkers working outside neuroscience proper who've been quietly arguing for years that even 11 is not the full count, that there are forms of perception we treat as cognitive or social or emotional when they are, at least in part, sensory. Ways of knowing the world that pass through the body before they pass through the mind. Now, I want to be careful here. None of these thinkers are claiming we have a 6th, 7th, 8th receptor system that physiology has missed. That's not the argument. The argument's way more interesting than that. It's that some of what we call intuition or attunement or a feel for the room is closer to sensing than we've given it credit for. And that we have systematically underweighted it, both in how we describe ourselves and how we live. Today, 3 of those forms, the aliveness Esther Perel writes about, the cultural attunement David Livermore studies, and the simple, strange fact that you can walk into a room and feel the mood of it before anyone has said a word.
Welcome back to Neuroscience Digest, powered by my BrainWise coach. I'm Cole Bastian.
And I am Phil Dixon.
And this is part 2 of our conversation on the senses. Last week, we walked through the 11 sensory systems neuroscience has actually identified, well past the canonical 5. Today, we are going beyond the 11. Phil is going to make the case that some of what we call intuition or attunement is in fact a sensory capacity, drawing on Esther Perel's work on eroticism as aliveness, David Livermore's research on cultural intelligence, and the social neuroscience of how we read other people. If you missed part 1, you can listen in either order, but the 2 together give you the full picture. So a quick ask before we get into it. If this show helps you think differently about how your brain works, please leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts. And like, comment, share, and subscribe on all our social platforms. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach.
BrainWise friends, I want to start with a big flag and waving at the top of this episode. I'm going to ask you to sit with something slightly unusual this time. We're going to talk about eroticism in a sense that has very little to do with sex. And we're going to treat cultural skill as a form of perception rather than a form of knowledge. If these framings sound strange at the start, give them a couple of minutes. They'll land.
So Phil, before you take the mechanism, let me name what I think most people do when they hear erotic intelligence. They file it as a sex topic and perhaps stop reading. That is a category error, but it is a predictable one, and it is worth explaining why it happens. We have inherited a very narrow English language use of the word erotic. Perel is using it in a broader, older sense, closer to the Greek's eros, vitality, life force, the capacity to be moved by what you encounter, aliveness, vibrancy, vitality. That is the phrase she uses, and she has been consistent on it for nearly 20 years. The shift she is asking for is not a shift in subject matter, it is a shift in what the word is allowed to mean. And the reason that matters for this episode is that once you take her at her word, the claim stops being about romantic concepts and context and becomes, I think, a claim about perception, about how engaged the senses are with what is actually present. That is the bridge that I think we should talk about and, take people through. So Phil, take it from here.
It's the right bridge to be addressed, and the neural picture supports it very cleanly. Perel's observation, stripped of the literary framing, is that most adults, most of the time, are operating at a significant level of sensory under-engagement. If you like, tasting without savoring, touching without feeling, hearing without listening. The senses are technically functional, but the attention required to actually receive what they're picking up is elsewhere. The world arrives at low resolution because the system that will render it in high resolution is just not engaged. The cleanest way to see this in the brain is the default mode network. We've talked about that before. It activates when you're not focused on a task, mind wandering, ruminating, doing self-referential thinking, planning, replaying everything. The brain talking to itself. In most adults, in most ordinary moments, the default mode network is doing a great deal of the work, and the sensory and attentional networks are running in the background, but not being prioritized. What Perel is pointing at is the inverse state. The default mode network quiets. The attentional and sensory networks come forward. You're actually here, receiving what is here, rather than narrating it from one step removed. Practices that train this state are well documented neuroscientifically. Mindfulness meditation, genuine flow states, certain kinds of physical absorption. It's learnable, it's practicable. And the cost of not training it is significant, both experientially and increasingly, we suspect, neurologically. A brain that rarely operates in high-resolution sensory engagement is a different brain over time than one that frequently operates there.
And the L&D version of the implication, which is the one that I keep landing on, is that it is not a peak experience problem. It is a baseline erosion problem. The cost is not that you miss the dramatic moments. The cost is that the ordinary moments arrive blurry. The coffee you do not taste, the conversation you do not quite hear, the walk you make from the car to the office without registering anything that happened in it. Or for me, the car ride when you're driving home and you don't remember how you got there. That one's a little more dangerous than the others. None of these are crises, perhaps maybe besides the one you don't know how you got there one, but they are all just slight degradations that compound across thousands of repetitions. And the recovery, which is what Perel is actually arguing for, is not exotic. It is attention restored to the channels the body is already running. That is the practical hook of this whole segment. When did you last actually taste your coffee? Not drink it in while doing 4 other things. Taste it. Most people who are asked that question, honestly, cannot remember. That is the territory I think we're discussing here, right, Phil?
It is. And to add a neurological note to your point, Cole, the difference between drinking coffee while distracted and tasting it deliberately is not a small attentional shift. It's a measurable change in which networks are running the show. The deliberate version recruits the salience network and the attentional networks. The distracted version leaves the default mode network in charge. The subjective difference, the sense of actually being present with the coffee, corresponds to a real difference in the brain. It's not romanticism. It's that which network do you choose to be allowed to be the driver?
Livermore is particularly interesting to me, partly because of where his work sits institutionally. He is not in a neuroscience lab. He is, in fact, researching cross-cultural effectiveness in organizational contexts, and his audience is largely L&D and global leadership development. That matters most because of the people who use the CQ model in practice, and I have used it in practice, treated as a knowledge and skills framework. You assess someone, you find their gaps, you build a development plan. It works more than less, and the most effective practitioners I have watched do not look like people running a framework. They look like people reading the room, which raises the question that I think we should sit with for this segment. Is high cultural intelligence, or CQ, actually a cognitive capacity, or is it closer to a perceptual one? Phil, lay the model down for us first and then take the neural side.
You got it. Livermore identifies 4 factors that make up cultural intelligence. CQ drive, which is the motivation to engage cross-culturally. CQ knowledge, which is what you actually know about cultural similarities and differences. CQ strategy, which is the metacognitive ability to plan and adjust during such a cross-cultural interaction. and CQ action, which is the behavioral flexibility to translate insight into effective behavior, either the same or different. The full model has been developed and validated through more than 2 decades of peer-reviewed research, much of it building on the psychometric work of Sun Ang and Linn van Dyne. And to your question about whether this is cognitive or perceptual, watch what happens when you observe somebody with high CQ in a real cross-cultural situation. They're not consulting a database. They're not running a checklist. They are reading the room. They're picking up the tone of voice that signals something different from the words. We talked a little bit about that in the listening context. The pause that means consideration in one context and disagreement in another. The spatial difference that's comfortable here and confrontational there. Below threshold cues that they've integrated before conscious analysis arrives. Livermore himself describes a subdimension of CQ strategy called awareness, not a new word, but he defines as the ability to pick up on cues in the midst of the situation, including body language, tone of voice, or indirect communication. That's sensory work. He calls it metacognition because that is the disciplinary frame he's operating in. But functionally, it's closer to perception than to reasoning. The likely substrate is substantially interoceptive. The skilled cross-cultural communicator is feeling the room in their body before they are naming what they're feeling. Bud Craig's work on the anterior insula gives us a credible mechanism. The insula combines internal bodily signals with social and contextual information into something that arrives in awareness as a felt sense. That felt sense is what high CQ practitioners are using. They've trained it through repeated exposure to genuinely diverse environments. And once trained, it operates faster and more reliably than deliberate cultural reasoning could even do.
Which has a direct implication for how this is taught. And this is the part that I think we should make explicit. Cultural intelligence training that focuses purely on knowledge transmission. Here are the dimensions, here are the differences, here is what to do in country X, is missing the component that actually predicts effectiveness. Livermore's own research, including a large meta-analysis from 2018, found that cultural knowledge by itself can be counterproductive without the other 3 factors. You can know a great deal about the culture and still be tone deaf in it. The knowing is not the doing. The doing requires the perceptual capacity, and the perceptual capacity is sensory training, even if no one in the L&D world is calling it that. And the design implication for anyone listening who builds cross-cultural development programs is that the most leveraged hours are not in the classroom. They are in genuinely diverse environments where the body is forced to do the integration work the slides cannot do for it. The classroom hours are necessary for scaffolding. They are not the training. The training is exposure with attention. The third capacity I want to put on the table is the most ordinary and the strangest. The fact that you can walk into a room and feel the emotional state of the people in it before anyone has spoken. We do this constantly and barely notice we are doing it. And when we do notice, we tend to call it intuition, or being sensitive, or reading people, all of which are vague enough to keep the phenomenon at arm's length. I want us to take it seriously as a perception. Because if it is perception, then it has a substrate. It can be trained, and it has consequences when it is degraded.
And it is, in a literal sense, perception, not metaphorical perception. The neuroscience of how it works is partly understood and partly still contested, but the phenomenon itself is undeniable. Let me lay out what we know and what we don't. In 1992, a research team led by Rizzolatti at the University of Parma, working on macaque monkeys, discovered a class of neurons in the ventral premotor cortex, area F5 for those of you who want it, that fired both when the monkey performed an action, like grasping a peanut, and when the monkey observed another individual performing the same action. Now, we call these mirror neurons. It's become fairly common term now. The brain represented the other's action from the inside by stimulating it. That core finding is well replicated. It's settled science, as far as science ever gets settled. The extension of that finding to human social cognition, and particularly to emotional resonance and empathy, is where I want to be honest about the state of the literature. The popular extension has been influential, and unfortunately, it's been substantially overclaimed. There is a serious critical literature, including work by Hickok and a careful 2013 review by Kilner and Lemon in Current Biology, arguing that many of the popular claims outrun the evidence. In the popular vernacular, people are getting ahead of their skis. I take that critique seriously. What I don't think is contested is the underlying phenomenon. We do, automatically and often below conscious awareness, pick up on the emotional and physiological states of the people around us. Some people are better at it than others. Whether the mechanism is mirror neurons specifically, or the broader interoperceptive and automatic resonance systems, including the vagal pathways, the capacity is real. The threat state of a person across the room registers in your nervous system before it registers in your conscious mind. The concealed distress of a colleague who is presenting as fine is often felt first as a vague tightness in your own body.
So the cautious version of the claim is something like there is a real perceptual capacity here. The precise mechanism is more contested than popular accounts suggest, but the functional reality is well supported. We do not need mirror neurons specifically to be true to take the phenomenon seriously. And the implications that we want to land for our BrainWise friends is that this runs in both directions. You are not just a receiver, you are a transmitter. Heart rate synchronize, breath patterns synchronize, and stress responses propagate. If you are dysregulated, the people around you are picking that up at a level below their conscious awareness, and their nervous systems are responding before they have any cognitive narrative about why. Conversely, if you are genuinely regulated, not performing calm, actually calm, that is also being received. The leader who walks into a tense meeting and is genuinely regulated is doing something neurologically meaningful for the people in the room. They are providing a signal that the threat detection systems of the others they can use. The parent who is regulated in front of a distressed child is doing the same thing. This is not a soft skill. It is a perceptual reality with measurable consequences. And the most leveraged work most leaders and parents could do is in their own nervous system, because that is what is being broadcast, whether they intend it to or not.
Oh, that's the right place to land. The work is on the self, because the self is the signal.
So, Phil, what do you want our BrainWise friends to hold on from this one?
Oh, two things from my point of view. First, 11 was a useful answer last week. It's also probably an undercount, depending on how you draw the boundaries. Some of the most important capacities we have for navigating life are sensory in nature, even when they're not labeled that way. The aliveness Perel describes, the cultural attunement Livermore studies, the reading of other people that goes on continuously below our conscious awareness. These are perceptual capacities. They can be trained, and they are far more trainable than most adults realize. Second, the body knows more than we have been taught to listen to. That's true for the 11 senses we covered last week. Is it at least as true for the ones we covered today? The starting move in every case is the same. Pause. Ask what is actually being received. Notice what your body is registering before your mind has named it. That practice, repeated, changes the resolution at which you live.
For me, I think it's three things. First, the cost of leaving these capacities untrained is not abstract. It is felt as a low-grade flatness of experience, a chronic tone deafness in unfamiliar contexts, a tendency to be surprised by what other people are feeling when in fact the signal was there all along and you simply were not picking it up. None of that is a character. None of that is character. It is unused capacity. Second, the Perel point. Most adults, most of the time, are operating at a small fraction of the sensory bandwidth available to them. The cost compounds, the relationships you do not quite feel, the signals from your own body you do not quite hear, the room you walk into and do not quite read. None of those are dramatic. They are just slight degradations in a capacity that was meant to be much higher resolution. And they are almost entirely recoverable. And third, if you take one thing from this episode and part one together, let it be this. You have more sensing equipment than you were taught. Most of it is being underused, and the recovery is not exotic, it is attention.
I would have added one other thing in here. We're very proud of our senses, whether it's 11, 12, 13, or 15 of them. However, outside of the human race, animals have way more of those senses than we do. Just think of bats with echolocation, or rats with sensors at the end of their whiskers, or cats, or the dog that smells 1,000 times more than we do, or the eagle that has 1,000 times sight than we do. Or those, even dogs can pick up noise from, miles away, or dolphins pick up a whole variety of species. And we're probably not the smartest.
As always, thank you for spending time with us today, our BrainWise friends. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and always
stay BrainWise.